Well, it's Saturday evening again and lovely to have your company. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you know, last week I was so chuffed because I thought I'd done 10 of these stories. I'd actually done 12. So this is lucky 13. So I hope you've had a good day and a good week. And thank you for all your great comments that you put on the little Instagram pages and Facebook and things about what we read last week, because it's always nice to receive them. And off the back of that feedback, I've decided today to read a story but divide it into two parts. So the first part will be this Saturday and I will finish the story for you next week. And I thought it might be more interesting if it was sort of a bit of a mystery. So it'll leave you with a bit of a question mark hanging over it at the end of this first part. So I've chosen a book that my mum actually gave to me years ago. And it's a collection of short stories by the writer Jeffrey Archer, who you might remember wrote Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less, and it was a massive bestseller worldwide. And he since, of course, went on to write many more very, very successful novels and a couple of plays as well. So this is called A Chapter of Accidents. We first met Patrick Travers on our annual winter holiday to Verbier. We were waiting at the ski lift that first Saturday morning when a man who must have been in his early 40s stood aside to allow Caroline to take his place so that we could travel up together. He explained that he had already completed 2 runs that morning and he didn't mind waiting. I thanked him and thought nothing more of it. As soon as we reached the top, my wife and I always go our separate ways. She to the A slope to join Marcel, who only instructs advanced skiers. She's been skiing since the age of 7. I to the B slope and any instructor who is available. I took up skiing at the age of 41, and frankly the B slope is still too advanced for me, although I don't dare admit as much, especially to Caroline. We always meet up again at the ski lift after completing our different runs. That evening we bumped into Travers at the hotel bar. Since he seemed to be on his own, we invited him to join us for dinner. He proved to be an amusing companion, and we passed a pleasant enough evening together. He flirted politely with my wife without ever overstepping the mark, and she appeared to be flattered by his attentions. Over the years I have become used to men being attracted to Caroline, and I never need reminding how lucky I am. During dinner we learned that Travers was a merchant banker with an office in the city and a flat in Eaton Square. He had come to Verbier every year since he had been taken on a school trip in the late 50s, he told us. He still prided himself on being the first on the ski lift every morning, almost beating everybody else to the slopes. Travers appeared to be genuinely interested in the fact that I ran a small West End art gallery. As it turned out, he was something of a collector himself, specialising in minor impressionists. He promised that he would drop by and see my next exhibition when he was back in London. I assured him that he would be most welcome, but never gave it a second thought. In fact, I only saw Travers a couple of times over the rest of the holiday, once talking to the wife of a friend of mine who owned a gallery that specialises in oriental rugs, and later I noticed him following Caroline expertly down the treacherous A slope. It was weeks later and some minutes before I could place him that night at my gallery. I had to rack that part of one's memory which recalls names, as skilled politicians rely on every day. "Good to see you, Edward," he said. "I saw the write-up you got in the Independent, and I remembered your kind invitation to the private view." "Glad you could make it, Patrick," I replied, remembering just in time. "I'm not a champagne man myself," he told me, "but I'll travel a long way to see Vuillard." "You think highly of him?" "Oh, yes. I would compare him favourably with Pissarro and Bonnard, and he still remains one of the most underrated of the Impressionists." "I agree," I replied, "but my gallery has felt the way about Vuillard for some considerable time." "How much is The Lady at the Window?" he asked. £80,000, I said quietly. "It reminds me of a picture of his in the Metropolitan," he said, as he studied the reproduction in the catalogue. I was impressed, and I told Travers that the Vuillard in New York had been painted within a month of the one he so admired. He nodded. "And the small nude?" 47,000, I told him. "Mrs. Hensel, the wife of his dealer and Vuillard's second mistress, if I'm not mistaken. The French are always so much more civilised about these things than we are. But my favourite painting in this exhibition," he continued, "compares surely with the finest of his work." He turned to face the large oil of a young girl playing a piano, her mother bending to turn the page of the score. "Magnificent," he said. "Dare I ask how much?" £375,000, I said, wondering if such a price tag would put it out of Travers' bracket. It's got an itchy nose, sorry. "What a super party, Edward," said a voice from behind my shoulder. "Percy," I cried, turning around. "I thought you said you wouldn't be able to make it." "Yes, I did, old fellow, but I decided I couldn't sit at home alone all the time, so I've come to drown my sorrows in some champagne." "Quite right too," I said. "Sorry to hear about Diana, though," I added as Percy moved on. When I turned back to continue my conversation with Patrick, Travers was nowhere to be seen. I turned around the room and spotted him standing in the far corner of the gallery, chatting to my wife, a glass of champagne in his hand. She was wearing an off-the-shoulder green dress that I had considered maybe a little bit too risque for the evening. Travers' eyes seemed to be glued to a spot a few inches below the shoulders. I would have thought nothing of it had he spoken to anyone else that evening. The next occasion on which I saw Travers was about a week later on returning from the bank with some petty cash. Once again he was standing in front of the Ouillard oil of mother and daughter at the piano. "Good morning, Patrick," I said as I joined him. "I can't seem to get that picture out of my mind," he declared as he continued to stare at the two figures. Understandably. "I don't suppose you'd allow me to live with them for a week or two until I can finally make up my mind? Naturally, I would be quite happy to leave a deposit." "Of course," I said. "I would require a bank reference as well, and the deposit would be £25,000. He agreed to both requests without hesitation, so I asked him where he would like the picture delivered. He handed me a card which revealed his address in Eaton Square. The following morning his bankers confirmed that £375,000 would not be a problem for their client. Within 24 hours the Ouillard had been taken round to his home and hung in the dining room on the ground floor. He phoned back in the afternoon to thank me and asked if Caroline and I would care to join him for dinner. He wanted, he said, a second opinion on how the painting looked. With £375,000 at stake, I didn't feel it was an invitation I could reasonably turn down, and in any case Caroline seemed eager to accept, explaining that she was very interested to see what his house was like. We dined with Travers the following Thursday. We turned out to be the only guests, and I remember being surprised that there wasn't a Mrs. Travers, or at least a resident girlfriend. He was a thoughtful host, and the meal he had arranged was superb. However, I considered at the time that he seemed a little too solicitous with Caroline, although she certainly gave the impression of enjoying his undivided attention. At one point I began to wonder if either of them would have noticed if I'd had disappeared into thin air. When we left Eaton Square that night, Travers told me that he'd almost made up his mind about the picture, which made me feel the evening had served at least some purpose. 6 days later the painting was returned to the gallery with a note attached, explaining that he no longer cared for it. Travers did not elaborate on his reasons, but simply ended by saying that he hoped to drop by sometime and reconsider the other Ouillards. Disappointed, I returned his deposit, but realised that customers often do come back, sometimes months, even years later. But Travers never did. It was about a month later that I learned why he would never return. I was lunching at the large centre table at my club. As in most all-male establishments, the table reserved for members who drift in on their own. Percy Fellows was the next to enter the dining room, so he took a seat opposite me. I hadn't seen him to talk to since the private view of the Ouillard exhibition, and we hadn't really had much of a conversation then. Percy was one of the most respected antique dealers in England, and I had once even done a successful barter with him, a Charles II writing desk in exchange for a Dutch landscape by Utrillo. I repeated how sorry I was to learn about Diana. Well, it was always going to end in divorce, he explained. She was in and out of every bedroom in London. I was beginning to look like an absolute fool, and that bloody man Travers was the last straw. Travers? I said, not understanding. Patrick Travers, the man named in my divorce petition. Ever come across him? I know the name, I said hesitantly, wanting to hear more before I admitted to our slight acquaintanceship. Funny, he said. I could have sworn I saw him at that private view. But what do you mean he was the last straw? I asked, trying to take his mind off the opening. Met the bloody man at Ascot, didn't we? Joined us for lunch, happily drank my champagne, ate my strawberries and cream, and then before the week was out he bedded my wife. But that's not the half of it. The half of it? The man had the nerve to come round to my shop. He put down a large deposit on a Georgian table, Then he invites the two of us round to dinner to see how it looks. And he's had enough time to make love to Diana. He returns them both slightly soiled. "You don't look too well, old man," said Percy suddenly. "Something wrong with the food?" Never been the same since Harry left for the Carlton. I've written to the wine committee about it several times, but... "No, I'm fine," I said. I just need a bit of fresh air. Please excuse me." It was on the walk back from my club that I decided I would have to do something about Mr. Travers. The next morning I waited for the mail to arrive and I checked my envelopes addressed to Caroline. Nothing seemed untoward, but then I decided that Travers wouldn't have been foolish enough to commit to anything on paper. So I also began to eavesdrop on her telephone conversations. But he was not among the callers, at least not while I was at home. I even checked the mileometer on her car to see if she'd driven any long distances. But then Eaton Square isn't all that far. It's often what you don't do that gives the game away, I decided. We didn't make love for a fortnight, and she didn't comment. I continued to watch Caroline more carefully over the next fortnight, but it became obvious to me that Travers must have tired of her about the same time as he had returned the Vuillard. This only made me more angry. I then formed a plan of revenge that seemed quite extraordinary to me at the time, and I assumed that in a matter of days I would get over it, even forget it. But I didn't. If anything, the idea grew into an obsession. I began to convince myself that it was my bounden duty to do away with Travers before he besmirched any more of my friends. I have never in my life knowingly broken the law. Parking fines annoy me, dropped litter offends me, and I pay my VAT on the same day the frightful buff envelope drops through my letterbox. Nevertheless, once I had decided what had to be done, I set about my task meticulously. At first I considered shooting Travers, until I discovered how hard it is to get a gun licence, and that if I did the job properly, he would end up feeling very little pain, which wasn't what I'd planned for him. And then poisoning crossed my mind. But that requires a witnessed prescription, and I still wouldn't be able to watch the long, slow death I desired. Then strangling, which I decided would necessitate too much courage, and in any case he was a bigger man than me, so I might end up being the one who was strangled. Then drowning, which could take years to get the man near any water, and then I might not be able to hang around to make sure he went under for the third time. I even gave some thought to running over the damn man, but dropped the idea when I realised opportunity would be almost nil, and besides, I wouldn't be left any time to check if he was dead. I was quickly becoming aware just how hard it is to kill someone and get away with it. I sat awake at night reading the biographies of murderers, but as they'd all been caught and found guilty, that didn't fill me with much confidence. I turned to detective novels, which always seemed to allow for a degree of coincidence, luck and surprise that I was unwilling to risk, until I came across a rewarding line from Conan Doyle. Any intended victim who has a regular routine immediately makes himself more vulnerable. And then I recalled one routine of which Travers was particularly proud. It required a further 6-month wait on my part, but that also gave me more time to perfect my plan. I used the enforced wait well because when Caroline was away for more than 24 hours, I booked in for a skiing lesson on the dry slope at Harrow. I found it surprisingly easy to discover when Travers would be returning to Verbier, and I was able to organise the winter holiday so that our paths would cross for only 3 days, a period of time quite sufficient for me to commit my first crime. Caroline and I arrived in Verbier on the second Friday in January. She had commented on the state of my nerves more than once over the Christmas period and hoped the holiday would help me to relax. I could hardly explain to her that it was the thought of the holiday that was making me so tense. It didn't help when she asked me on the plane to Switzerland if I thought Travers might be there this year. On the first morning after our arrival, we took the ski lift up at 10:30, and once we'd reached the top, Caroline duly reported to Marcel. As she departed with him for the A slope, I returned to the B slope to work on my own. As always, we agreed to meet back at the ski lift, or if we missed each other, at least for lunch. During the days that followed, I went over and over the plan I had perfected in my mind, and I practised so diligently at Harrow until I felt sure it was foolproof. By the end of the first week, I had convinced myself I was ready. And I shall read you the second part and the end of that story next Saturday. Take care, look after yourselves, and have a great week.